I'll introduce myself and I'll go through a couple of housekeeping items. My name is Andrea Lesbrance. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Assembly of First Nations Environment Sector. I'm coming to you from my home about an hour southwest of Ottawa on Algonquin Anishinaabe and Mohawk territory. I've been with the AFN for a number of years, and in the last few months, we've been doing a lot of these webinars, trying to share as much information as we can with as wide of an audience as we possibly can. And so we thank everyone that's online. We have about 60 participants, and I believe a number more registered. So it really demonstrates to us the importance and the interest in environmental racism and environmental justice. And so hoping to facilitate some of the dialogue that leads to some productive and good work. On the meeting format, so we have a Zoom meeting as our format for today. So that does allow you to be on video or unmute yourself. I just ask that folks keep themselves unmuted unless I'm able to call on you. You can put questions in the chat throughout the session and I'll be able to call on folks. I can either read it for the closed captioning and translators or invite you to raise your hand and can call on folks to ask questions as well. We do have, the session is being recorded. The session will be posted on the AFN's YouTube channel. And I understand there might be some cross-posting as well with perhaps ECCC or other organizations. But we'll share the link to the recording with everyone who has registered for this session when it's available. There's also translation. The presentations, I believe, are going to be primarily in English, but you can go to the translation button, the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select your desired language. So if you're listening in and would like to listen in French, I'd suggest turning to the French translation button. There will also be closed captioning, and so you can access the closed captioning through the links that are available in the chat, and the closed captioning will also generate a transcript. The chat is enabled, and so if you have questions throughout the session, please put them in the chat and I can facilitate asking them to the presenters. There are materials available online. So right now we have an agenda, a backgrounder, and the presentation from Environment and Climate Change Canada. And we're working to make sure that Dr. Horn's agenda or presentation is up online as well. And as we go through and reference materials, my colleague Sunshine will put the links in the chat as well. So the purpose of the webinar, AFN is mandated to call on the Government of Canada to work in partnership with First Nations on environmental racism and advocate for the development of a First Nations-led environmental justice strategy that addresses the impacts of environmental racism faced by First Nations. We received a mandate through Resolution 26, 2024 at the last assembly in July. And the therefore be it resolved number 3 specifically says, and I'll read it because it's not too long, call on the Government of Canada to work in full partnership with First Nations, including the AFN, First Nation, regional, and other organizations, and rights and title holders, especially those that have faced environmental racism, to develop a First Nations-led environmental justice strategy to address the intersecting, cumulative, and gender-based impacts of environmental racism and injustices faced by First Nations. So the agenda for today, first we're going to hear with folks from Environment and Climate Change Canada. We have Amanda Monforton and Ryan Brent, as well as some of the other folks on their team with us today, and I'll invite them to introduce themselves at the beginning of their presentation. They're going to provide some background on Bill C-226 and the new piece of legislation that requires the development of the environmental justice strategy. Following the presentation from ECCC, we'll have an opportunity for some questions and answers, and would invite folks to put questions in the chat primarily, but if you'd like to raise your hand and speak to them, I can facilitate that as well. Following the Q&A, we'll have a presentation by Dr. Augusto Horn, who is the Medical Director of Clinical Care in the Department of Health in Akwesasne. Dr. Horn works and advocates on the health impacts of environmental racism and will speak to a presentation entitled Introducing the Intersection of the Indigenous Voice, the Environment, and Health. So with that, I'd invite Amanda and Ryan, if you'd like to introduce yourselves, and I believe Jana will be starting to share the presentation. So we turn ourselves over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. So hi, everyone, and thank you so much for making the time to learn about how Canada is hoping to advance environmental justice through the development of a national strategy. Before we begin, I think it'd be helpful, as Andrea said, to give an overview of who we are and the nature of our work. So Nadishnaka Amanda, Pequot Nagan Nindon Jiba. So what I just said there is that my name is Amanda Mofarton. I'm Algonquin First Nation from Pequot Nagan. I'm also the Director of Policy Development in the Strategic Policy and International Affairs branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada. I am leading the work of developing the environmental justice strategy. And before I go any further, maybe what I will do is ask Ryan to briefly introduce yourself if you'd like.
Sure. Thank you very much. And to just echo Amanda's point, thank you so much for having us here today. We're really looking forward to having these conversations with people. I'm Ryan Brunt. I'm a senior policy advisor in Amanda's team at Environment and Climate Change Canada. I am a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario with family roots in the Red River homeland. And I've been on this file, I think, just under 2 years as we've been sort of starting to think through how it could roll out from the passage of legislation C-226. So thrilled to be able to start having these conversations now that the legislation is through.
Thanks, Ryan. So as the director responsible for the development of efforts related to a national strategy to assess, prevent, and address environmental racism and to advance environmental justice, I can't stress enough how important it is to incorporate a diversity of views and experience on this complex topic. Although we're here today to talk to you about Bill C-226 and the approach to strategy development, our team also does other important work. So this includes providing advice within the department to our colleagues towards addressing inequities and engaging with communities that have reached out directly so that we can better understand their concerns and realities. Today, we will provide some of the information and context around environmental justice and racism concepts. And then we will dive into some preliminary thoughts around how to seek development of a First Nations engagement approach on environmental racism and environmental justice related to the development of the national strategy. This builds off an acknowledgement of the importance of First Nations knowledge and perspectives as we develop approaches to engage First Nations, meaning we will have an approach to engage First Nation that reflects their roles and realities. By doing this, we can undertake engagement with First Nations to build a robust and meaningful strategic approach to environmental justice that addresses First Nations priorities. So environmental justice as a principle and concept has evolved since the 1980s as part of a social movement to address the unfair exposure of poor and marginalized communities to harm. While there's no established definition, the principles and concepts of environmental justice are broadly understood to include procedural justice, which is about improving the ways in which decisions are made and ensuring that those that are most affected are included in that decision making. Recognitional justice aims to acknowledge and respect the differences between people, groups, and their concerns, needs, and livelihoods. Distributive justice is about inequitable distribution of environmental burdens, such as pollution, and seeking to improve environmental benefits for said communities. There's a critical nuance between environmental justice and the related concept of environmental racism. Is that environmental racism is one form of environmental injustice. A commonly used definition of environmental racism is racial discrimination in environmental policymaking and enforcement of regulations and laws, and the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, the official sanctioning of the presence of life-threatening poisonings and pollutants for communities of color, and the history of excluding people of color from the leadership of the environmental movement. So coming into Bill C-226, which passed this past June, it came into force on June 20th, 2024. So when developing the strategy, the minister is required to include a study examining the link between race, socioeconomic status, and environmental risk, as well as information and statistics relating to location of environmental hazards, and include measures that can be taken to advance environmental justice and assess, prevent, and address environmental racism. While that language leaves some room for interpretation, the general intent of the Act is clear in the preamble, which focuses on Indigenous, racialized, or other marginalized communities and hazards such as landfills and polluting industries. Focusing the strategy to this intent, that is, focusing on the intersection of environmental hazards and marginalized communities, it will be important to maintaining a manageable scope within the broader concept of environmental justice and the short legislative timeline, while delivering a meaningful, measurable outcomes. We see that the Act requires the minister to develop a national strategy to promote efforts across Canada to advance environmental justice and to assess, prevent, and address environmental racism, with an emphasis on national. The minister must table the strategy within 2 years of the Act coming into force and report on it every 5 years. In developing the strategy, the minister is required to consult or cooperate with any interested persons, bodies, organizations, or communities, and ensure that it's consistent with the Government of Canada's framework for the recognition and implementation of the rights of Indigenous peoples. My team is paying particular attention to this last requirement, and we'll speak about that more at length later in this presentation. But right now, I'll pass it over to Ryan.
Thanks, Amanda. So I think we're going to just talk a little bit first about sort of initial framing thinking around the strategy, and then into more of our sort of Indigenous engagement approaches and thinking. So it's a really loaded question right at this front end about what a strategy could achieve, because again, we're very early days, and so it hasn't been developed. We're in the process of developing it and trying to have some of these early conversations to get a better sense, but not starting necessarily from zero. And so some of the initial thinking in terms of how you position a national strategy is around things like mapping the federal landscape to understand, okay, where are the opportunities here? Understanding the knowledge field and making sure we're sort of building our understandings as we go, which is really important. We talk to communities and understand where they're coming from as well. Thinking about measurable outcomes and indicators. So again, you can have a strategy, but with the absence of a clear indicator of what would you actually get from this, it's really difficult to understand whether you're succeeding or not. And then thinking about approaches to build awareness and collaboration with communities. So again, the experience of environmental racism and environmental injustice is often quite local to a community, and you need to be able to think about how exactly you can bring communities back into this conversation. Go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the next steps, it's driven very heavily out of the content of Bill C-226. So at the sort of high level, the two sort of series of next steps are engagement and consultation and study. So on the study side, it's more about making sure we have kind of a baseline understanding. This is all very new, and so we're focusing primarily on understanding what information we already have at a national level and how we can bring it together to better understand the context of environmental racism and justice. The flip side of that is engagement and consultation being really critical, that you can't just look at the map and you can't look at the math to understand the experience of people. So thinking about engagement and consultation at community levels and with sort of meaningful engagement to make sure that we're respecting people's lived experience. And in the case, particularly for our Indigenous peers, is the Indigenous rights and making sure we're respecting those through this process. So one of the big things for us is, again, thinking about how do you keep the scope meaningful and you keep the scope achievable, but how do you make sure that you are meeting the needs of Canadians as you're thinking about what exactly the strategy might actually do. And so engagement's a huge part of that. And I think that's where we're starting a little bit of our conversation today. So just moving into the next slide, please. So in terms of how we're going to think more specifically about our Indigenous peers is applying an inherent right to respect, or an approach to respect inherent rights. And so C226, as we mentioned previously, is really, really clear about making sure that we're recognizing the implementation of the rights of Indigenous peoples. And so we started thinking about, okay, what does this mean, right? And so a lot of it has to do with making sure that we're thinking through things like UNDRIP and making sure that we're making real opportunity for Indigenous peoples and First Nations peoples in the context of our discussion today to actually participate in the engagement process. And a lot of it has to do with making sure we're thinking about the current consultation burden. I think it's not necessarily lost on us that right now, there are a lot of questions and a lot of ideas and a lot of concepts being sort of brought to Indigenous communities with the expectation that they can reply back. And we're trying to make sure we keep the time and space to have a meaningful consultation on this without sort of rushing it out the door. So I'll go to the next slide, please.
Brenda, can I just pause for 1 second? There's a couple questions in the chat that I think it might be helpful to address, and specifically because you were just talking about consultation opportunities. I'll read the first and then the second, or sorry, the second and then the first.
Sure.
So when will consultation opportunities become available, and how will people know about these consultation opportunities? And there was also a more general question. So I'll just flag it for you and then I can reread it if you want to address the first. But a general question from Rod at Six Nations: how is ECCC collaborating with other federal departments that have a mandate or fiduciary obligations specific to environmental matters in First Nation communities? For example, ISC has a federal contaminants program for First Nations and federal sites. Albeit at present, this program is limited to the 1990s environmental issues inventory, and for the most part excludes more recent environmental regulatory gap circumstances on reserve. So perhaps the first question on consultation, and then how ECCC is kind of liaising with other departments that have fiduciary obligations.
Sure. So on consultation and engagement, so far we've got the enviroequity.ca website, which I believe my colleague Jana has just posted into the chat for us. And so it's sort of the home for ECCC's efforts in this space thus far. And that's where a lot of the information will be coming out as engagement begins. To be really, really clear here, we're really early days on engagement. And I think that's why we're having this conversation early, is to try and make sure that we're taking time to talk about how we engage right up front. So there is going to be materials going on there in the short order. So sort of things like webinars and other presentations that people can get into that are the broader framing, but we want to work with Indigenous partners in particular to think about what the Indigenous specific or Indigenous tailored approaches are going to look like for that. So there isn't necessarily a list so far of the engagement efforts coming up. It's more that we're trying to develop them and make sure that we're well informed as we do that. But they will be coming up on the EnviroEquity website as they're prepared. The second one, I'll try to gather the question, but please let me know if I'm sort of meandering off of what the intent was. So I think it's about our integration with other departments and how we're reflecting on what they're doing. I think a big part of this is as we hear things back from our engagements and our processes, a big part of the environmental justice piece is what we're calling, I think, policy coherence, but putting that in sort of plain language is we're not here to duplicate the efforts of what's being done elsewhere, but we're trying to make sure we're aware of what's available in the space already, and then better understanding where people are seeking sort of strategic support that might not be covered in other existing spaces across the federal government in particular. And so that's part of the conversations we'll be having as we go. We've already been reaching out to other federal departments to try and better understand where they're at and think about what they're up to in the space. And as we go and we hear things back and we engage and people are bringing up ideas and concepts or their experiences with other programs, we can kind of feed that bit back into those other departments and then understand how that intersects with us. One of the early examples we would use is, there's the discussion that you're going to be having later this month that's very specific to the right to a healthy environment and the integration of environmental justice as a principle into that. that's one example where the concept is being applied in the context of a specific program or a program with two M's and an E. But that is not sort of the specific strategic tool that the government of Canada is going to use, which is, I think, closer to where we are at. And so we're just trying to constantly be in contact with our partners inside and outside to make sure that we're better understanding what the need is. And again, that's a big part of the consultation and engagement that's going to come up.
Maybe I'll just add a little bit more to that. So I think it's really important to note that we are taking a whole of government approach to this. So meaning that all of the development too will involve other federal departments and agencies as well. Much of the environment, this in work is not limited to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and actually will go beyond that. So it will include things like the Fisheries Act and other different pieces of environmental legislation. But the idea here is to really say, yes, we are Environment and Climate Change Canada, but there's a lot of work in environment spaces that happens in other departments as well. And how do we make sure we bring that together and understand how these programs interact with one another and really look at, is there an opportunity? Is there a change that needs to be made to a program, policy, or legislation? And that's what exists within the bill. So that's a really forward-looking piece, but you have to first assess the issue to understand, and then really understand how these pieces come together. That's informed by not only the qualitative data, but the experience of those that are impacted. I'll pass it back to you, Ryan.
Sure.
Thanks, Amanda.
Can't necessarily see the chat on the screen, so if you
No,
let me
that's
know.
okay. I'll read it. There's one more question in the chat, and I think barring any more questions in the chat, I think we can move on to the slide after you want to speak to it. So how will the strategy be coordinated nationally, i.e. in provinces and territories, given that Bill C-226 is a federal law? And I would also maybe just add to the question, is your department liaising with provinces in any way? Because I think that there's in different parts of the country, different relationships between the provinces and First Nations.
That's a good one. And I think I'll take that one, Ryan. And if you want to jump in, feel free. But this is a really important piece because of jurisdiction. And so right now, the legislation itself is directed towards the federal government. But that said, we know that provinces and territories play a really important role in this. So we have been working to engage at both the provincial and federal level as well. But when it comes to addressing an instance of environmental racism, that's where it's really important to understand. That's where you're going a little bit more targeted. So when you're addressing it, you need multi-jurisdictional collaboration. So that is something that's a really big piece of this, and how we collaborate with provinces and territories will largely be dependent on the issue at hand. So again, the federal government cannot force the province to do this, although what we can do is say, these are the issues. This is where your jurisdiction is. This is where ours is. But how do we find a place of multi-jurisdictional collaboration to respond to the specific needs of that location or that instance of environmental racism? But I will let Ryan add anything to that one if I missed anything.
No, I think that's good.
Thanks, Ryan. I see one more question coming up in the chat. So understanding Indigenous rights and climate leadership is currently included in the new Strategic Environment and Economic Assessment, SEEA. Will you be looking to reflect environmental racism/justice more specifically in the SEEA, which was required to be completed by all federal departments for all new policies and programs?
So that's a good one. And that's actually a really interesting question, because this is something that we've been following very closely. So even more broadly than environmental justice and racism, if we talk about this from a sustainability perspective, there is that equity component. So I will say more broadly on environmental justice and racism, we are very well connected to that work. and have been since the inception of them coming forward. So we are looking at how do we find that coherence between the two places. And you'll probably notice that in the last federal sustainable development strategy that came out, actually environmental justice was reflected in that, which is one of the tools that is used. The strategic environment and economic assessment is also used to report on that federal sustainable development strategy. So yes, this work is very important to that, and we are working closely with them, but I don't have a result to share right now.
Thank you. Ryan, did you want to add to that as well, or perhaps address the next slide? I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat at this point.
I might move through to the next slide so we can
Sure.
sort of continue on.
Thank you.
So where we kind of left off was the idea that we're trying to make sure that we're operating and respecting Indigenous rights. And so thinking about how you frame Indigenous rights in the context of EJ for us has a lot to do with thinking about UNDRIP in particular, so the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the associated UNDA Act. And thinking about free, prior, and informed consent as kind of an underpinning thought and concept for this, talking about, okay, before we get too far down the road, we should be engaging with our Indigenous partners, which is sort of why we're starting the conversation now before things are being developed. And the right of Indigenous peoples to participate in decision-making that impacts their rights, and then thinking specifically in UNDRIP about the rights to conservation and protection of the environment and to the productive capacity of lands and resources for Indigenous peoples. So we've been trying to take these into account and thinking about, okay, we need to build that into the framing of what we do going forward. And then also thinking specifically about UNDRIP as sort of formalized through UNDA and the action plan that's associated with that, thinking about the requirement to consult and cooperate, and in terms of using cooperative mechanisms with representative organizations. But one of our biggest thinking sort of challenges is the term representative organizations sort of, I don't want to say understates, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the complexity of realities for Indigenous people. So each Indigenous rights holder might be represented through multiple different organizations, and trying to understand how people would like to be reflected and who represents their interest is really critical to us in terms of understanding how and who we engage and how that gets integrated back into the eventual strategy development process. So next slide, please.
Thanks, Ryan. I'll just note, let's try and slow the pace down a little bit for the translators, but I don't mean to cut you off. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll do. So this is kind of, I think this is actually the last slide, so it's a good place to lead off. So when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about a separate kind of time frame for the EJ strategy. So there's the 2 years that we have for the initial strategy to be tabled in Parliament. And that's going to include meaningful rights-based engagement with Indigenous peoples. We're going to be making sure Indigenous rights and Indigenous concepts and perspectives are included there. But we're also thinking about taking a longer-term opportunity to engage with Indigenous peoples and rights holders as we think about what Indigenous focus strategies and First Nations focus strategies, for example, are going to mean to them. Right. And so for us, that's why we want to start the conversation at this kind of place, is understanding. So when we're working with First Nations people and trying to do First Nations focused engagement, what does that look like? How do we work together to actually get a better outcome for First Nations peoples? How do we develop our understandings of First Nations concerns and perspectives? And what are the considerations we need to take into account? And so as we move forward, we're hoping to be able to hear from First Nations peoples and rights holders and people that sort of represent them in terms of how can we make sure we have sort of a thorough, meaningful conversation that results in a better strategy development process that integrates a lot more of that lived experience and perspective of rights holders. And so I think I'll stop at that. I think that's the end of the strategy, other than some additional information at the tail end in terms of how to contact us if you have an interest in the file, and happy to answer any questions that might come up now.
Thanks, Ryan. There was one question that Amanda addressed in the chat, but I'll just speak to it for the translation and closed captioners as well. So there was a question, do Indigenous partners include Indigenous governments or individual community members as well? And Amanda responded both. Amanda, did you want to speak to that further?
Yeah, I can expand on that one a little bit. So this actually reflects what we see in Canada's implementation of UNDRIP. So the UN Declaration Act actually talks about both individual and collective rights. So we really have to make sure that we are giving the opportunity for both Indigenous peoples as Indigenous rights holders to engage, but also governments, but also organizations. But we want to hear from everyone. Ryan, if you want to jump in, if there's anything else to add there, feel free.
No, that's it. I think we're trying to make sure that we do as well as we can with engagement to try and get the range of perspectives, and so that it's a well-informed strategy and not sort of being driven by one particular perspective.
And
Thank
the
you.
other thing I will say is that really important, the legislation said any interested persons, bodies, organizations. So really important to note that we are not targeting anyone. So if there is interest in engaging on this issue and you want to have a focused discussion on your specific location, it's very important that you reach out to us to engage, because something like environmental racism is not a label that you can put on people. They must speak for themselves and they must express that interest.
Thank you, Amanda. There's a question in the chat, so I'll read that. ECCC had to fine INAC/ISK under SEPA fuel storage regulations with a question mark, albeit $1 for a fuel spill on a Northern Ontario First Nation. What mechanism are there to ensure integrity, non-bias in investigations, compliance, enforcement, retribution, and environmental mitigation?
Yep, I'll take a first run at this one. I think thanks for the question, Rod. I appreciate it, and I'm going to start by saying, unfortunately, I'm not able to speak to a specific case that you've got in mind, so I won't be able to answer necessarily in technical speak. And I think that's a great question for some of our colleagues that work more in the technical space on regulation. But I'm going to take sort of the question and frame it in the context of our work, and that's part of what we're thinking about as well, right? Is when you think about regulatory efforts of the federal government in particular, how does that sort of integrate, or how does that intersect with environmental justice? It's actually a fairly considerable piece of the work that we're doing in the background, is to make sure that we have those understandings of how those intersections occur, and if there's sort of different perspectives on how the government operates with respect to, again, protection, compliance, enforcement, things like that. So something we're interested in for sure. And I think as we hear more from communities and from people that have experiences like what you're describing here, we'd probably be better informed to actually speak to that in terms of what does that mean in terms of strategy development. But I certainly appreciate the question. And like I said, I apologize, I don't have more information on that specifically.
Okay, that's great. Amanda, did you want to add anything to that before I go to the next question?
Maybe I'll just say that we recognize that the enforcement piece is a really important portion of this, not only where fines are given, but also where they are not. And so all I want to say on this one is that we are working very closely with our colleagues in enforcement and having these discussions to ensure how are we going to incorporate. It's great that we're developing a strategy too, but in practicalities, what does that look like for enforcement here within the federal government? So that's a really important piece of this.
Thank you. I'll go to the next question. Can you please speak to the relationship between the environmental racism strategy and the right to a healthy environment implementation framework? And just before maybe I go to Amanda or Ryan, I'll note that we will be hosting a webinar on the right to healthy environment implementation framework. And I believe it was in the same set of registration information as this webinar, but we will circulate it again after the webinar today. So Amanda and Ryan, did you want to speak to the RTHE framework?
Absolutely. So this is actually a really important piece, because the right to a healthy environment is limited to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So we work very closely with them, and the right to a healthy environment implementation framework is an administrative piece of how they implement this through their activities within SEPA. So, whereas environmental justice is much broader than the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and goes beyond just how they administer those provisions of that act. So, there does have to be coherence between the environmental justice strategy and the right to a healthy environment, although it is not, again, not limited to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So I don't know if that answers the question. We could probably talk more about it if you'd like, but at a high level, that's what it is.
Thank you. Brian, did you want to add there before I go to the next question?
Nope, I think that's about as much as we can add.
Okay, that's great. There was a response to one of the previous questions, but it did show up. So in past policy initiatives involving consultation and engagement, the federal government have really pushed on knowing if the Indigenous governments would be representing themselves or the communities they serve. There's been a great deal of confusion regarding this issue. From the federal perspective, the issue is more of a funding issue, as it's obviously easier, quicker, cheaper, and more efficient to engage with an Indigenous government instead of its communities. I just wanted to flag this issue now so we can figure it out prior to meaningful consultation and engagement starting on environmental justice. And I think that speaks the piece about governments versus individuals. Did you want to respond to that, Amanda?
Absolutely. And I'm going to give a little bit of context too. So I introduced myself as a First Nations woman. Ryan introduced himself as a Métis person. One thing is that we realized is that when we were approaching this work, what was really important is that we had a team of people that actually are the same as those we are trying to work with. So that team is fully Indigenous right now. Pardon me. And that was one thing that we've all been speaking to very strongly, because we want to make sure that, you know, people on the ground, we have lived experience ourselves and we understand how it works in First Nation communities. And that's a really big piece for us to ensure that we're also reflecting that of Indigenous rights holders and not simply the governments, the Indigenous governments. So we're taking a very different approach here. And it is an approach that makes a lot of, I will say, federal colleagues uncomfortable. And I think that when you look at the issue of environmental justice and racism, it requires a different approach. So again, I want to be clear. We will engage just as much with interested peoples and communities and rights holders as much as we will engage the governments themselves as well.
Thank you. Brian, did you want to add there, or should I go to the next question?
I think we'll go to the next question. I don't think I can do any better than that.
Great. Okay, great. So presumably ECCC policy folks and technical folks are not lawyers. What role does the federal DOJ lawyers have in this campaign? And are there resources for First Nations to recruit their own legal counsel to assist in the review of the bill? And I'll just add the next question too. Will there be funding available for First Nations to participate in this process?
Okay, so I will start off with this one. So one thing is the bill itself is actually only saying that you have to develop a strategy. So I'm not sure that having to assist in reviewing the bill, all it says is that the minister needs to develop a strategy and be consistent with the rights of Indigenous peoples. So I think, and we have to undertake consultation. So the bill itself, I will say, I'm not sure if there's a lot to go on there. But I will say that we do work very, very closely with our Department of Justice colleagues and the lawyers there. And this is a really important one because as Indigenous peoples that understand these rights very well, it actually enables us to have more fulsome discussions with our colleagues and actually really make sure that the advice that we're getting aligns with the understandings that we all have as Indigenous peoples. So I will say that Ryan does connect very often with the lawyers as well. And maybe I'll just pause to see, Ryan, is there anything that you wanted to add before I go into the consultation portion?
No, just other than I think, yeah. So Bill C-26 is passed, and in terms of reviewing it, it really is quite sort of a light legislation in terms of what the obligations are. I mean, it's up to everybody who they feel like they need in terms of expertise to review some of the materials. But I think from our perspective, we're starting from sort of, I'm not going to use the word normal because I think we're actively trying to sort of do something a little bit different, but the policy development process doesn't necessarily require lawyers through and through. Where we're at is trying to sort of talk to people and understand what they would see coming out of a strategy. Um, and then that realistically, like there's legal questions that will come along the way, in particular as you get towards the end and obligations towards the federal government. But for the time being, we're really, really focused on just trying to understand what this could be and how you make it meaningful for people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing to be clear about is that we've been referring to it as the bill, but it is now law. So it has passed, received royal assent, and it's now the law of Canada. So it might not be the same circumstance where First Nations are reviewing a bill to see if they want to intervene in the parliamentary process. But to Ryan's point, it's up to folks to determine who they want to bring in doing reviews now. I will just ask you to speak to the funding portion for supporting communities' involvement in the development of the strategy of national scope and also potentially the First Nations specific strategy. And if you don't mind too, kind of speaking to the potential distinction between those two processes, if there is one.
Absolutely. So I will start and then I'll pass it over to Ryan. But right now, so the first step is to have a conversation with someone. We have to understand. So we're saying, will there be funding available? I mean, I think at this point, there is funding that exists, but we need people to reach out to us to have a discussion. And it doesn't start first with funding. It also starts with understanding what this work is and understanding how you may be implicated in it. And more broadly, we're also looking at there's going to be a first initial strategy, but again, we are considering a focused First Nations strategy or an Indigenous strategy, sorry, that will have perhaps separate timelines. And that's where I'm going to pass it over to Ryan to talk a little bit more about that and what our thinking has been.
Yeah, so I think just to sort of reiterate, and I think that's the nature of the conversation we're having today. Even it's just that we're trying to think through how best we're going to engage with people, and trying to get feedback from people that we'd like to engage with in terms of, well, how should we do this? And so we don't necessarily have a big conversation ready on funding because of the fact that our first step is to just try and understand, well, what is it we're trying to do? And then we'll have a better sense of, well, what do you need in order to do that? But sort of the way I kind of look at our the nature of our approach that we're trying to take is, truly start from the beginning is let's talk about what it is we're trying to do first, and then get to all the pieces that are required to get us to the end.
And maybe just a little bit more. What happens in one nation in Ontario may be very different than what happens in the West Coast in another area. And these are very much location specific to what the needs are of the community. And one of our big things is that it's not a one size fits all approach. And really, that environmental racism is a geographic distinct location. And so how that is approached is very different. And we can't say what happens on one side of Canada is going to be the same on the other side.
Thank you. There's one comment in the chat and a question, and I'll just read it for the translation and transcript from Rod. So just a comment that while government recruits Indigenous peoples, that's great, and he acknowledges he was one. There are public servants' limitations and sworn oaths of allegiance to HMK and speaking truth to power. Rod, I'm going to admit that I don't know what HMK stands for, but I'm sure there are other folks on the line that do. If you'd like to spell it out in the chat, please do so. And a question from Dana Lynn. So funding is a big
Maybe
area
we could acknowledge the comment first, actually,
Sure.
because I love this comment. You know, I think looking at my title right now, one of the things underneath it is I'm the co-chair of the Indigenous Employees Network for the department, which means a lot of my role is actually speaking truth to power about Indigenous issues and issues that impact the employees here, and how also decisions of the department do impact employees at the end of the day as Indigenous peoples. They're not just Indigenous employees, they are Indigenous rights holders as well. So that is one piece that has been very key, and that while there are challenges in speaking truth to power, we do have the opportunities to do so here on this file specifically. And I don't want to get into too many examples per se, but I will say that as someone that's been in the government about 25 years, I think, um, this has definitely been the file where we've had that opportunity to ensure that we are actually representing the voice of Indigenous peoples and using their words to inform decision making. So, Ryan, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that one.
I don't think I can add much to it. And I think, I mean, even just looking at a lot of changes in the last decade in terms of the federal interaction with Indigenous peoples, and I think you're seeing it a lot more now within government as well.
Thank
We've
you for
had some
that.
really great opportunities as a team to visit key places actually with the minister. And so we went to Fort Chipewyan in northern Alberta, and for a team to interact directly with the minister, which is the political side of the government, it's quite different. And we're seeing definitely a different approach here within the federal government on this file. So we've definitely had opportunities to speak to the highest of the levels here about these issues. And we've been welcomed to these opportunities to engage with these people and understand their concerns from their perspectives as well, and also look at what people have already said, because a lot of us say the same things and we're always putting these things forward, and it's making sure that everyone's time is being used in a meaningful way.
Thank you. I see a few questions in the chat. I'll just flag that I think if Amanda and Ryan don't mind, we'll spend 5 to 10 more minutes maybe addressing some of the questions. If folks want to keep putting questions in the chat, that's totally fine. We'll, after about 2:10, we'll continue to make note of them. I will say too, one of the things that we hope to do or will do after this webinar is send out a questionnaire with some discussion questions. And so that will go to all of the registrants, and there'll be opportunities to input additional information or questions, and we will share those with our ECCC counterparts, as well as Amanda's contact information is on this slide as well. And maybe we'll put that into the chat so folks can just copy and paste it directly. So Sunshine, maybe I'll ask you to do that. But I think we do have a few more minutes for questions. So the next one is funding is a big area of concern. In Ontario, we have Green Shovels, Nature Conservancy of Canada, and Invasive Species Centre controlling the funding. The First Nation territories get the scraps, and will these organizations be involved in the process? And I'll just read the next question too, if you want to kind of speak to both. Will the strategy be distinctions based?
So, all great questions. And I think this is why we have such a discussion internally about who represents who. So, making sure that the people that are coming to us, if there's an organization saying that they represent this community or these people, we actually need to hear from those people that that is actually the case. And it's important that we know, and this is why we can have lots of people approach us as the federal government. We will listen, we will hear what they're saying. But we also have to make sure we circle back with the rights holders to make sure that they are actually being represented by these groups. So representation is a really big concern for us. And will the strategy be distinction-based? So again, the story on environmental racism is actually quite different for Métis people. It's different than First Nations, and it's different than Inuit. So there would have to be some sort of distinction between the three, because the considerations, because of the Indian Act, have created these kind of differences in approaches as well. So Ryan, maybe if you want to jump in, feel free.
No, just oh, I'm good. A funny one. Just to reiterate that, it's interested parties. So there's nothing to stop anybody from reaching out to us to have these conversations whatsoever. So if organizations want to reach out to us, that's wonderful. But we are really taking a focus on making sure that we're hearing from rights holders as well, and not necessarily always through representative organizations. And again, that's why a big part of the question that we've got is like, how can we make sure we get out there without sort of adding a ton of burden to everybody that all of a sudden they've got, emails coming in left, right, and center that they're being expected to answer.
And I think too, another thing is, you know, we spent quite a bit of time going through and I'll speak specifically to First Nations right now, but what have First Nations already said? We went through every single submission that came in under the United Nations Declaration Action Plan. Even though they didn't pertain necessarily or they weren't supported, we wanted to go through every single one of those because what we found in those was there were so many instances where it might not fit something perfectly over here, but this information is really important and it's already been said. So we spent a lot of time running after some of the folks in the government that have been engaging with you to understand what has already been said. Because again, we need to bring those pieces together because this conversation is not new. It's not a new discussion, but we're bringing a new focus to it. Sorry, Andrea, go ahead.
No, that's great. I think that starts to get at the next question. So Travis had put in the chat, environmental racism is not new to us. So knowing our ancestors long gone have made declarations in regards to most of this, will Canada be referencing our retroactive ancestral concerns?
So this is a big part of recognitional justice. And what I'll do is I'll ask Ryan to respond to that one because it's something we've considered at length.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's sort of interesting for the conversations we're having is trying to make sure we're understanding where everybody's coming from, right? Like, so environmental racism, environmental justice, they're steeped in history. Like we didn't just get here yesterday. This is long historical sort of timelines. And so the more we can work with people that are interested to understand where they're coming from, the more we can understand what a strategy might be able to do for them. Right. And that's why, again, this engagement becomes so important in moving outside of sort of numbers and, analytics and into what is the actual experience of people. And so I think the more we can have those conversations around history and making sure that we understand the nature of the concern, the better the strategy is going to be. And I know it sounds like a kind of vague answer, but I think really a lot of the answer to this is we want to have these conversations.
Thank you. I'm going to read two more questions and one comment. And Amanda, I think you're well positioned to answer about gender-based analysis plus. So how will the strategy apply gender-based analysis plus to addressing the intersectionality of identity factors that compound vulnerability to environmental injustice? For example, the intersection of race, socioeconomic status, sex, and gender. Sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was excited about this question because actually the Gender-Based Analysis Center of Expertise is under my leadership as well. So we understand the linkages between these two pieces and how important it is. And so we're actually looking at how do we use gender-based analysis as one of the tools to support us through this? And so there is one dedicated position on my team of someone that works between the two pieces. We will actually be looking at how are we applying the gender-based analysis plus lens from the very beginning. So we've been working at this since day one because you shouldn't be even considering this without understanding putting that lens on it. So we really want to make sure we're going to use this as a case study for gender-based analysis plus two to demonstrate how we are considering all of the intersectional factors through the design, development, and future implementation of this work. But how are we also going to monitor that and ensure that we are demonstrating results?
Thank you. And there's a question from Ernest in the chat. Is there a point in time where current environmental projects or projects in development have to be compliant with the outcomes of this result?
So that's a really interesting question, and I don't think it's something I can give a full answer to right now. But we do know there are lots of instances of environmental racism that are right here in front of our faces. And I will say that we have been working very closely with, for example, Aamjiwnaang First Nation, and have been a key part of their journey through some of the successes right now and supporting them to get where they did with that interim order, and really making sure that the community voice is at the center of the decision-making table as well. So we've had opportunities to kind of what is happening now and how can we perhaps apply an environmentally just approach to the instance of environmental racism that exists. So recognizing that, that is also why our team actually got moved. And now we reside under the Indigenous and Intergovernmental Affairs Directorate to ensure that we are well connected between the provincial territorial relationships with the federal government, but also the Indigenous relationships.
Thank you. Ryan, did you want to add anything to that? And then there's one more comment about representative organizations.
Just really, really quickly on that, I think the really important piece is again that we're doing strategy development, and so the intent isn't to create new necessarily regulation out of this piece. I think it's more to understand what are we doing with what we already have, and then what kind of advice or guidance might we be able to provide at times, or how do we feed back into the system and sort of take a lens to how the government operates with respect to environmental racism, environmental justice. So it's not necessarily that there's going to be a compliance outcome from the EJ strategy. We don't know that yet because, again, the strategy hasn't been developed, but it has a lot to do with just sort of taking a look at, again, that how do we operate and then what mechanisms do we have and how are they being used as is.
Thank you. I'll read Katarina's comment. For Southern Chiefs Organization, a representative aggregate organization for 33 First Nations in Southern Ontario, our definition of representative organization is an organization which is mandated and actively directed by the leadership, chiefs and council of the First Nation they represent. She also adds, this is a definition other representative organizations and First Nations across Canada support as well. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Did you, Amanda or Ryan, did you want to reflect on that as well?
No, it's very helpful. I mean, I appreciate that. And I think if other people have similar sort of understandings from their own sort of communities and organizations, we'd really appreciate hearing them as well. Because I think, again, it's the crux of the conversation is just trying to make sure we're getting to the people.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Rod, thank you for the acknowledgement in the chat. Rod says, yes, Nyawagoa to late Murray Sinclair and calls to action. And thanks you, Rod, for the reminder. I meant to, at the beginning, acknowledge the passing of Senator Murray Sinclair and his contributions. Amanda, did you want to do the same?
Yeah, I actually did. And I wanted to say that was a shock to our team quite a bit. And one thing that we spent a lot of time doing in the initial days was actually looking at what are these calls to action? What does the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples and those recommendations that came out of there, what do the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission say? What do the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls to justice say? What do the action plan for the UN Declaration Act, what do they say? How do they align together? And how does that fit within this story as well? And how can we be contributing to advancing all of these calls to justice and calls to actions through our work as well? And I just wanted to say out loud that I am so thankful for Murray Sinclair and all of the leadership that he provided, and it was a big loss.
Thank you. Maybe just before we go to Dr. Horn and her presentation, was there any closing comments that you wanted to offer, Amanda or Ryan? We did put Amanda's contact information in the chat, so if folks are looking to follow up offline, please feel free to do that. And like I said, we'll also be circulating some materials that will allow further discussion. But over to you, Amanda and Ryan, if you wanted to provide any closing comments.
Yeah, so my closing comments are really, again, our door is open. So if you want to discuss, we are here. Number one. Number two, also just reflect on how difficult this work is as Indigenous peoples inside the federal public service. And I will say I've seen a dedication like I've never seen in this team. And I'm thankful for every single person and how we support one another and also how we work with Indigenous peoples on the outside. And for me, this file touches very close to home. having dealt with impacts, and there's many people I think from my community here too that have dealt with the impacts of nuclear waste and other issues. And we are really going to do our best on this file. That is my personal commitment to everyone here, is that I will do my best to advance this in a good way. And I look forward to working with all of you. So Ryan, if you have anything you want to go for it.
Well, I see Elder Point has her hand up first, and I'll yield to her.
First, I just want to say to Iathalto, Amanda, and Ryan, to Iathalto, been there, done that in education. And if I learned anything, it's partnerships work. And having you both there is really important. It's all you have to do is walk in a room and there's a shift. And I can tell you, when our own provincial government asked me to work with them to do the work I was already doing in my community, it was called a secondment half-time. And if you know anything about education, education is the poor brother in any First Nations government. So all I thought about as well is the funds I could use for language or culture or. But when I talked to my boss and I walked in his office and told him I was being asked to do this, he said, "Gwen, why would I send you to work for the enemy?" And I kind of stood there like, oh, they're the enemy. Did not ring for me because it was the Aboriginal branch of education. He said, "Convince me why I should send you." And I looked at him and I told him, until we are involved on every level of government, across the agencies, then and only then can we make change. We have to know. We don't know what we don't know, right? So to Iathalto, thank you for that. And I do believe in partnerships. Take care.
Thank you, Dr. Point. And I agree with you. Partnerships is key on this work. And one thing I will say is you have to understand how the system works in order to change the system. That is my big mantra that I use with everyone, is that if I don't know how that system works, I can't change it. And so if this is what I can do, is to understand the system, that's the only reason why I work with the federal government. I'm proud to be a public servant, but I'm proud because I support people on the outside. I'm a public servant. So Ryan, I'll toss it over to you.
No, looking, I just want to say thank you so much to everybody and your thoughtful questions today and perspectives. And hopefully some of you will follow up with us, because we're really hoping to continue the conversation. And I won't hold anybody up because I'm really looking forward to Dr. Horn's presentation.
Thank you. Thank you both. So I think we'll ask our IT folks to bring in Dr. Horn to the spotlight here, if you don't mind. And we requested and we reached out to Dr. Horn. I had previously heard, I think, a version of this presentation, and I just found it to be really insightful articulation of the experiences of one community with a history of environmental racism and how their community is experiencing the ongoing health impacts and what's being seen in the community. And so we invited Dr. Horn to come and speak to the audience today in order to try and facilitate folks on the line to articulate the situations of their community in really cohesive and comprehensive ways. We know every First Nation community has experience with environmental racism throughout their history and ongoing impacts, and just hope to provide a platform for folks to speak to those experiences. And so we're doing that in one way today, and we'll have other opportunities to do that with other partners as well. But Dr. Horn, thank you so much for being with us today. I know you're very busy. I heard that this might have been the 5th presentation that you've been giving this week. So we really value your time. I do think that we can spend the bulk of our time together on your presentation, so please don't feel rushed. We do have about half an hour or 35 minutes, and so please take your time. And if there's questions, I can facilitate that as well. So over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I just want to begin. Can you see my first slide?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so, well, good afternoon. My name is Ogisto Ganawahare Horn. I'm from the Ganyankehaga communities of Kahnawake and Akwesasne, which are of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I've worked for 16 years as a family physician in both communities, taking care of my people through all stages of the life cycle. And today I'd like to introduce the topic involving the intersection of the Indigenous voice, the environment, and health. We acknowledge our mother, the earth, Yatinistaha Ohunza, who provides everything we need. We think of the rocks quietly watching our conduct, particularly as they are mined for their gifts. We acknowledge the waters from where we are made and what we're made of. We thank the animals, those in the waters, the small insects, the no-legged beings, those large and small with 4 legs, and the ones that fly. The birds, whom we can still hear bringing in each day with their tones, reminding us that we're not alone. We describe the natural and domesticated plants and berries, those that carry the medicinal knowledge in their roots, stems, flowers, and leaves, and the small and large trees. We acknowledge the 4 winds, the thunders, and the lightning, which wakes up the earth and sends those things that can hurt us back into their own spaces. We recognize that there are buffer zones that protect us that protect us, and they are now being eroded, and we're less protected from the harms of these things that we've never met, but for whom also have a right to exist. We acknowledge our sun, our moon, and the stars, these celestial beings who light our skies, land, water, and ice, watching with patient interest. And finally, we think about Sky Woman, her grandson, the creator, and the mind inside nature, that great energy that thought about all this. I do not have any financial disclosures, conflicts of interest, or potential biases to mitigate. The only bias I have is that I am an Indigenous woman who has worked at this intersection for a very long time. I'm involved in many things outside of the community clinic that directly impact my works. The intersection of the collective experience, voice, and health of women, Indigenous people, and the environment are the focus of my work and extensive relationships across Canada. I will highlight that I am the medical director of the Department of Health in Akwesasne. My role is to ensure that the clinical perspective is acknowledged in all decisions and works of the department. This summer, I became the president of the Indigenous Physicians Association of Canada. And many families who, to hide from the eyes of the church, the Indian agents, and the police, carried out their ceremonies deep in the woods at night. These families have carried this knowledge through time. My family was one of these families, and we have midwives, a bone setter, those who knew the plant medicines, those who were part of the medicine societies, and those who were political forces, trying to stop the inevitable tide that came over our lands after contact and industrialization. There are many reasons why we, the Indigenous people in Canada, have been unable to steward our lands. Importantly, indications of our presence to where we have lived from time immemorial has been for the most part removed or made redundant. For instance, the names and descriptions of the places that we lived, fought, hunted, prayed, and played have been removed from the maps and collective consciousness of Canadians. For example, as you pass through the mountains of British Columbia, through Kicking Horse Pass and Golden, there's a small town called Donald. I think he was a superintendent of the railroad. But for the Tunaksa and Secwepemc Indigenous people from the area, and I will not try to say it in their language, but the translation of what they named the place was where the wind camped for his big Sundance. What a breathtaking Indigenous name to describe this beautiful place. So today I'm going to describe some of the terms that are used when talking about the health of the environment. I'm going to recognize that we are all inspired at some point in our lives to become active. I will propose a framework to describe the social determinants of health through a pre-contact, colonial, and contemporary perspective. And I will tell one story about the health of the environment and its impact on health. And then, of course, have concluding remarks. So let's situate ourselves. In medical schools, we learn about the biochemical and pathophysiological processes of individual humans, paying attention to the homeostatic mechanisms that make a person healthy. Public health focuses on the health of regional communities. Global health focuses on the international community. One health includes domestic and wild animals. And finally, planetary health is the new field of study, recognizing the connection between human health and the health of the planet, right back to where we Indigenous people started. Human health and civilization depend on healthy natural systems, but these natural systems are changing at an unprecedented rate due to human-made stresses. This new epoch of time is called the Anthropocene. There are 9 planetary boundaries described as tipping points that are being monitored. We have passed the natural homeostatic tipping points of the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, freshwater change, land system change, loss of biodiversity, climate change, including carbon dioxide concentration, and novel entities such as plastics and radioactive waste. The tipping points that we have not passed are stratospheric ozone depletion, ocean acidification, and aerosols in the atmosphere. I remember 3 important messages from when I was a young adult. First, I had this poster on my wall which states, "Only after the last tree has been cut down, only after the last river has been poisoned, only after the last fish has been caught, only then will you find that money cannot be eaten." The inverse relationship between capitalism and the environment imprinted me as a young person. Second, in the early 90s, a movie was released called From the Heart of the World, The Elder Brother's Warning. And this documentary, which you can easily find on the internet, is about a plea by a South American Indigenous people for ecological sanity in a time when the earth is being ravaged by so-called civilized people. The third message was found in the movie Clear Cut, a 1991 movie where the main character, Arthur, played by Graham Greene, kidnaps the developer set to clear cut their lands, despite the protests of the local Indigenous people. He drags this man up to a ledge that could be a place where the people fast and do ceremony. Overlooking the beautiful land and trees, he asks the developer if he can see her. And of course, he can't see the beauty and life in front of him. And I realized now that at that time that everybody does not see the natural beauty of our mother. Later that decade, the late John Trudell, in one of his speeches, says, "We will not destroy the world. Man has an ability to destroy all the people's ability to live on the earth, but we do not have the ability to destroy the earth. The earth will heal itself. The earth will purify itself of us. It has, if it takes 1 billion years, and the earth has that time. We do not. And so this brings us to this place and time today." I've made a framework to discuss and describe the social determinants of health called the stepping stones. So we're going to start on the left, beginning with the worldview of the society. How do we think that our world works? How do we conceive of time? What are the great objectives of our lives? Next, based on this worldview, what are the rights that our society will support? How will we support collective rights, individual rights, corporate rights? And next, what are the legal frameworks that support the upstream rights? Forming the rule of law, these include the treaties, papal bulls, decrees, declarations, constitutions, contracts, bills, accords, and acts that society agrees to adhere to for peace. And next, what institutions have the mandate to carry out these legal frameworks? What are their roles, responsibilities, policies, procedures, and accountability measures placed to support the rule of law? And then, what are the processes or programs designed to do this work? Finally, how do individuals and groups interact with each other? In essence, informed by all the upstream factors, what is the culture of this society? I use this structure to help me organize most of my presentations. I divide the stepping stones into pre-colonial, colonial, contemporary, and future perspectives. I illustrate the use of the stepping stones framework using the details of my own people, the Kanien'kehá:ka, or the Mohawk, or the people of the Flint. To begin, everybody has their creation story. Ours describes how Sky Woman fell from a place above, called Garden-Hiage, carrying dirt in her hands, to this massive dark place of water. And as she fell, the winged and water animals helped her to safety and helped her land on the back of a large turtle. In thankfulness, she spread the dirt from her hands onto the back of the turtle, sang seed songs, danced, and through a series of reciprocal relations, the turtle grew and grew, becoming Turtle Island or North America. The first person was a woman. She survived by having reciprocal relationships with all part of creation. She was thankful and she showed her thanks. She was not trying to return to Skyworld, and she was pregnant. There is an increasing interest in including Indigenous ways of being and knowledge into discussions about the health of the planet and the environment. Our ways of being are found within our Thanksgiving addresses. Where I come from, we have the Ohanda Gardiwa Dekwan, which are the words that come before all others. In this address, we acknowledge that our Mother, the Earth, has provided for us everything that we need to survive and thrive. All parts of creation have come to this place with their own original instructions and have the right to carry out these instructions in a balanced way. As humans, we have the responsibility to steward the air, water, land, and ice where we find ourselves. We are here on Turtle Island to steward this part of the earth, and other people were placed on other parts of Mother Earth to steward their lands as well. For the Haudenosaunee, much knowledge was carried within the design of our wampum belts. Beads made from quahog shells were strung into belts, commemorating important decisions and protocols. The teachings are timeless. Here we see from the top the small condolence, the dish with one spoon, the women's nomination belt, the coming of the people with white faces, the two-row wampum, the ever-growing tree of peace, the circle wampum, and the Hiawatha belt. These wampum belts describe timeless ethics, the importance of sharing land and her bounty for everyone, not to hoard, not to take more than one needs, the importance of having women nominate the leadership, the importance of not bringing past grievances into the present, helping those who are vulnerable, non-interference, finding support, and always being on the lookout for oncoming danger. We are all one height. We must always reaffirm our relationships and not to manipulate the truth to cause misinformation and disinformation. For the Haudenosaunee, we organized ourselves into clan families. In this governance structure, everybody has a responsibility to participate, and that means we must listen to the deliberations, have patience, think for ourselves, find our voice, and put our thoughts and experiences into the well of knowledge. Through these long discussions, a consensus of truth would be found, and only then would deliberations be made to find the best decisions. We may not agree with the decision, but we would understand how the decision came to be. We had ceremonies that acknowledged the cycles of time and life. These encourage good relationships with ourselves, between each other, our community, those outside the edge of the woods, the past, the future, and of course, the land and other beings. And then, informed by all the upstream factors, is our culture. For instance, every child comes into this world with a gift, and it's our responsibility to help this child grow, have many experiences, to become inspired, find their gift, learn it, and become an expert. Our communities aim to support those safe spaces for our children and youth to find their gifts. I will next go to the next part of our presentation. It's important to recognize that each of our cultures have our own stepping stones describing our own worldviews, governance systems, ceremonies, and culture. So I can only speak where I come from, but I'd like to talk about the colonial and contemporary reality. So let's contrast briefly with the societies that came to Turtle Island. In the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, bringing in the Middle Ages and instructions for people on how to live their lives. Importantly, we have hierarchy, patriarchy, land ownership, which is private, a fear of the natural world, and a goal of life towards rapture. In this world, the rights of some men were more important than the rights of others, which were certainly more important than the rights of women and children, domesticated animals, wild animals, and smaller beings. Individuals owned land and provided licenses and taxes for others to pass through, hunt, fish, and forage on their lands. The doctrine of discovery, a set of legal principles, was a belief that all lands occupied by non-Christians or heathens, when found by explorers, could be acquired on behalf of the crowns they represented. These principles were codified in the papal bulls. The procedures included finding the land, reading out an edict, letting the heathens know about their intentions to take the land, planting a cross and a flag, and then making efforts to occupy the lands. Slavery, the removal of natural goods onto ships bound for Europe, and the decimation of native people were colonial behaviors describing the conduct of individuals and groups in colonial North America. Of course, this is a very different set of stepping stones indeed. There are 3 main acts in Canada that underline the inequities that exist between Indigenous people and Canadians. The British North American Act of 1867, which formally recognized the Dominion of Canada, divides the mandate to provide the provision of services between federal, provincial, and territorial and municipal governments. The Indian Lands Act of 1924 removed the stewardship of the land from that of Indigenous people to that of the provinces and territories. We still held title, but not stewardship. And of course, the Indian Act, which is the persistent and very racist legislation that governs all aspects of many Indigenous people's lives today. So what does this mean? Services provided by municipal governments to Canadians are not provided to Indigenous communities. Specifically, the federal government, through the elected on-reserve band councils, administer services and are responsible for providing roads, water, housing, waste, sewage management, connecting to the power grid, communications networks, economic development, and emergency planning. Due to poverty and lack of resources, individual community members will allow for waste disposal on their properties without environmental oversight. And community leadership may accept short-sighted, harmful, and economic ventures. Band councils also administer those services on reserve that are provided for by provincial governments. These include health, education, social services, natural resources management on reserve, environmental assessment and enforcement, and sports and recreation. Many band councils do not have the human, logistical, or financial resources to provide all these services. Most communities do not have a high school, and their strategic planning needs are not in the curricula that the kids are taught off reserve. Provinces and municipalities do not include Indigenous communities in their emergency services plan. Band councils provide licenses for economic ventures and are also expected to provide environmental oversight, which can be a conflict of interest. Our communities have experienced a complete breakdown in the social fabric. Women are not assumed safety and security. Many people are incarcerated. Nearby man camps have created drug, alcohol, and sexual exploitation problems. We have mental health disequilibrium, apathy, and feelings of learned helplessness. We have yet to research the generational effects that chemical pollutants such as PCBs, mercury, lead, aluminum, and fluorine have on the neurodevelopment and cognitive decline of the people who are exposed. There are changes at the global, international, and national levels. The United Nations is creating standards for addressing the loss of biodiversity and climate change. UNDRIP aims to ensure that grassroots Indigenous voices are reflected in the decisions that are made on their behalf. International agreements between Canada and the United States exist, but their enforcement is not clear. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act now includes the right to live in a healthy environment. Bill C-226, an act to create a strategy to address environmental racism and injustice, was passed this year, and this is what we're here to talk about today. But the mandates to carry out these federal acts are the provinces, who do not have jurisdiction on Crown and Indigenous lands. So our band council must do this work, and I have happily heard some of this discussion today. The COP15 United Nations goal is to conserve 30% of the planet's biodiversity by 2030. But 85% of this biodiversity is stewarded by Indigenous people, who are 5% of the population. Are states going to increase their support to Indigenous people to continue to steward the land, or are there gaps in the legislation that corporations will exploit to continue on as usual? We need to be substantively involved in Bill C-226, the strategy to address environmental racism and injustice. Environmental laws have regulation gaps, and we must be watchful, just like the eagle at the top of our tree of peace, always looking out for danger. In 2012, there was a grassroots movement called Idle No More, which opposed proposed changes to the Navigable Waters Act, which would have decreased environmental protections of the water. Almost all blockades, barricades, and standoffs involving Indigenous people have to do with protecting the land. Unfortunately, there is a difference between advocacy and activism, and many of our people are arrested, face violence, and even death when protecting the land. Until recently, we were able to sustain ourselves. In my community, men left for ironworking jobs in the big American cities, building skyscrapers and bridges, and women would stay home taking care of their families while tending huge gardens, harvesting medicine such as maple sap, and participating in politics and supplement income with crafts. Akwesasne is located at that area on the Ganyat-Darawanano, or St. Lawrence River, where there are thousands of islands home to deep and shallow waters, wetlands, and a rich array of birds, wildlife, and fish. Today, it straddles the US-Canadian border. In the 1950s, the building of a massive dam on the river brought cheap hydroelectricity to the area. Soon, there were 6 massive factories encircling Akwesasne, pouring their effluent into the air, water, and soils without environmental regulations. It took only a few years to see changes in the health of animals and pollinating insects, such as bees. Many studies were conducted, and wildlife, such as turtles, had levels of pollution that are considered toxic waste. The research is summarized by a community midwife, Gudgie Cook, my aunt. By contaminating our food chain, including mother's milk, with toxic compounds such as PCBs, dioxin, DDT, and many others, corporate society has removed from us our very ability to feed ourselves, our families, and our communities. Exposure to toxic contaminants in the environment, air, water, soils, local food, fish, wildlife, and mother's milk has resulted in a rapidly changing epidemiology among many Native people. In 2019, an independent study measured all 209 forms of PCBs called congeners around our community. The results were worrisome. An unusual PCB congener called PCB4 was found ubiquitously in the bark of trees that were 200 to 200 years old. Finding PCB4 is unusual, as it was not within the set of congeners that Monsanto made and sold. Parent PCB molecules over time are being degraded by anaerobic bacteria into PCB4, which are lighter, evaporate, and carried into the air to distant sites, and they are highly carcinogenic, more than their parent compounds. Routine environmental surveillance protocols by the Environmental Protection Agency only measures the parent PCB molecules. So reports of decreasing levels of PCBs in the environment are misleading because they do not include the increasing amounts of their degraded, more carcinogenic, and volatile daughter forms. Some of the measurements that we are using to collect data do not reflect the newest prevailing scientific research, and we always need to update our data. Those children that played in the effluent of these factories are now in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. I am seeing a heavy burden of illness in my clinic, such as cancers, neurological, autoimmune, endocrine, and mental health disorders. The pollution has not been adequately cleaned, with large areas containing deep sediments, tailing ponds, and contaminated soils that have been sitting for decades. Some pollutants have naturally degraded, and some are now more toxic than their parent molecule, and we don't have any data. In one generation, we've lost our economy and ability to take care of ourselves. The economies available to us are mostly related to waste management and the selling of products that draw people to spend money in our communities: casinos, gas, cigarettes, cheap alcohol, cannabis, and the sex industry. We now have human smuggling, which is expected to increase with the migration due to climate change. There's a huge soup of toxic chemicals in the environment in Akwesasne. They accumulate in the fatty tissues, including the brains and nervous system. The only way to remove some chemicals, like PCBs, is in the mother's milk. And the target load goes to the largest load goes to the first child. We have many children with neurodevelopmental disorders. We do not have data. These chemicals also cause cognitive decline and movement disorders, which are the health concerns that we see in our younger elderly patients in long-term care. There's a new wave of industrialization coming to the area to access the green hydroelectric power from the nearby dam. Their environmental evaluations do not include the impacts that they will have on the sleeping contaminated sediments, soils, lagoons, and waters. There are no public plans to clean the sites further. We are speaking up, but it's hard to find people who can truly listen. Why do we, an Indigenous community from Canada, have to implore the United States Environmental Protection Agency to hold their corporations that are under active surveillance accountable to their pollution and risk of disturbing and dispersing this pollution? The sleeping monster on the edge of my community is slowly waking up. It should be noted that it's not illegal to dump toxic waste on Indigenous land. In our medical clinic, we don't learn or routinely, in our medical practice, we don't learn or routinely test for heavy metals and other chemicals. We don't learn how to do this in medical schools. And there are other concerns. In places where hydroelectric reservoirs were filled with water, communities were displaced, and the flooded biomass underneath slowly released their natural stored methylmercury into the water. Bioaccumulating up the food chain, methylmercury is found in the fish and wildlife, and due to its neurotoxicity, the people are instructed to eat only small amounts of fish, and now are eating more expensive and less healthy food from the grocery stores. The ice roads and the trails are less reliable, more dangerous, the hunting season is shorter, and people must use expensive helicopters to travel from their camps. Consumers in the South, benefiting from the clean energy produced by hydroelectricity, while those who live near the dams and reservoirs suffer profound food insecurity and safety issues. With the North heating up faster due to climate change, the stored methylmercury in the permafrost will be also released into the water, causing further neurotoxicity. We are more affected by weather extremes. Communities have poor infrastructure. Most do not have house insurance. And the federal government does not have a legal obligation to ensure clean drinking water. We are not included in general natural disaster emergency response plans. There are fewer options of where to go in an emergency. There is moral injury. We have not been able to steward the lands, as is our responsibility. This all happened on our watch. There's an exacerbation of already elevated mental and physical ill health, leading to increased risk for elder abuse and other forms of exploitation. There are many books that are available to learn more about the relationship between the health of the environment, the health of the people, and the Indigenous voice. And so when we look at our community, we are creating a whole group of people, a consortium, you could say. We want to look at individual risk factors. What's the pathophysiology of PCB4 molecules in the air and our lung health and our neurological health? What are the other exposures? How can we measure it? How can we measure individuals? And how do we measure the community and the land? How do we screen for cancers at younger ages? What are the autoimmune illnesses that we have here? What are the subspecialties that we need to come to our communities? Neurologists, psychiatrists, rheumatologists. How do we make our electronic medical records better to reflect the situation in our community? How do we measure the land? How do we improve the research literacy? Do we need boards in our community? That's what we've done in Akwesasne. How do we disseminate this information to the community? How do we create alliances to advocates like those who can help hold the EPA to hold their other industries accountable? How do we maintain interprovincial and international boundaries and uphold the agreements that are protecting them from these pollutants that do not recognize these boundaries? How do we go back to the health of the land? How do we go back to the land in a healthy way when there's so much pollution? By not engaging with nature, we are not stewarding her, and she's not reciprocally able to give back. We are sick. She is sick. Our non-human relatives, they are sick. But we have memory. This memory is found in our languages. How do we return to the principles of reciprocity, thankfulness, safety, safely reinvigorating our relationships, and think generational? We can do this, but we need to work together, and we need to have a plan. I appreciate your time and attention. Now I'll go off.
Thank you so much. There's one comment in the chat, and if you don't mind, can we spend a couple minutes with questions if folks have any? So I'll just read the comment in the chat from Kayla. Would like to please be able to connect with you at a later date. She said, "My name is Kayla C. Peters, and I will be the doula in my community, a part of the Cheslada Carrier Nation, South Bank, British Columbia. So perhaps we can make that connection offline." Were there any other comments or questions for Dr. Horn at this time? I think sorry, I'm just copying and pasting the comments so I can make sure to send an email connecting the two of you, if that's okay. Dr. Point, I see your hand raised. Can we go to you?
Yes, thank you. Also, Dr. Horn, thank you for your good work and for your leadership. And this should be made into a documentary and should be part of universities are always looking for material. schools and school districts are always looking for material. And every part of your presentation is so relevant and is so important. I want to just say that people ask, what's the answer? And there's no one answer to address any issue. And it's going to take presentations like this. It's going to take leadership at another level. It's going to take partnerships. And the other part I think that's so relevant is prayer, including spiritual people. And I know you have that message in there throughout your presentation. And I can only share a quick story about being at a powwow gathering, and we were told to go back to our camps because a tornado was coming. And we're all younger. This is 25 years ago, maybe. And so my concern was my children in the camp, and we all went running. But as I was leaving, elders slowly start walking, not to their camps, but to the stage. And so I stopped and I watched them and I asked them what are they doing? They're going to pray. So while we're all running away, they sat down collectively and started praying right in the midst of where this tornado is supposed to go. And by the time I got things settled and we laid, I went to sleep because you're so tired from being at a powwow, right? I was out. And I woke up and I thought, it's so quiet. What the heck happened? And I asked my husband and he said nothing. So when we started talking to others, they said, oh yeah, it's on the radio how that tornado was coming directly towards the area. And as it got closer, it split in two and fizzled out. Right.
Well, I absolutely don't doubt what you're just saying, because obviously we all have, or I have grown up with a lot of these memories. And so when we talk about having a solution, the reason I think it's so important to talk about our wampum belts is because, which I haven't seen a lot of, and so that's why I've started to do that, is because we have so much governance structure and protocol and that are embedded in the stories of our wampum belts. I mean, we're Haudenosaunee. That's what we have. We have our democracy, our ways of engagement, and so that's why I keep talking about it, talking about our history there, which is this is our Haudenosaunee. The other thing I noticed, I just came back from the COP16 deliberations down in Cali, Colombia, and I was struck by the back and forth that was going on to create a consensus statement. And I was like, wow, this is just like what happens in the Longhouse. Everybody's talking and talking and talking and talking and debating tiny little words to get this consensus statement. It takes forever. And I was like, see, if the United Nations can have the time and the patience to be able to come up with this consensus statement, we should be given the time to come up with consensus in our own communities. And that, I think, is very important. Where we come from, everybody has a responsibility to not just understand what's going on, but they have to participate and they have to say something. Even if you're a little kid, you're supposed to say something. You have to get involved, and we need to involve our youth and our children, including our elders, and we have to use our ways that we used to do to get everybody's voice together. We have an idea how to do it in where I come from, and we all have those embedded in the memories of our people and our culture. And I think that that is one way to make sure that we find the best solution.
So thank you very much, and excellent presentation, and I appreciate your good work.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thank
Goa.
you.
There's similar comments in the chat. This was excellent, Chimigwech. What a wealth of knowledge, Dr. Horn. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. Yaogo, beautiful presentation. There's another comment that's a little bit more substantive from Rod, that it's inspirational that Akwesasne continues leadership in the decades following the AFN's Eagle project of the 1990s, where Dr. Lickers from NCA was the lead principal investigator. We need leadership and youth, women, and warrior champions, as Elder Point states, prayer and restored reverence for the natural world, Skana. And Kay said this was a really great presentation. I agree with Dr. Point. This would be great to share with universities, colleges, and elementary schools, and others saying yeah as well. So thank you so much for that. Is there anything that you'd like to say in closing with all of the I think praise that's coming in from the chat?
So I think the reason I came up with this stepping stones framework is because we have to understand why we keep falling into these problems, and it's because we're going on a different paradigm that is very different from the way that we were. And if we can work like the Tura Wampum and in parallel, so that we can start to, use our ways to approach this problem, and the other, ways of Canada, their problem. And if we can do parallel, we can do some pretty wonderful things. And we also have to have access to all of the money that was put aside from the sale and lease of our lands and the natural resources, that we never got any of it. But we need to be able to access some of that funding. It's a huge amount of money. It's not like there's not enough there. We have the Indian Trust Fund. And also I do think that, when children come into this world, I've delivered like a lot of babies, like I did a lot of years of obstetrics. And every time that baby was born and came into this world, and I put the baby on mom's belly, and all the people in the room were so excited for this new baby. It was interesting that the mothers would bring their daughters and say, watch Dr. Horn, watch her. And I felt such an important, it was such an important teaching thing for them to see us actively involved in this really important process, delivering a baby. So all of our doulas and our midwives and our traditional medicine people and all our knowledge holders, we need mentorship, and they have to be given the support to have mentors, because we need to have our young people see us doing things instead of just reading about it or hearing about it. We need to be actively engaging our youngsters to inspire them so that they may find their gifts, and then they can be, learn and be their own expert. And then we can start through a generation, have a completely different perspective. But we have to start at our children. We have to start engaging in politics. We have to support our languages, our youth, our traditional medicine, our doulas, our midwives, all of that knowledge that we had to lose. And we have to bring it back from the underground and support that knowledge base coming back, because that is our way.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your time today. A few more thanks coming in the chat, and just acknowledge Amanda's comment that we need, lots of comments coming in, that we need to remember that those impacted by environmental racism are further impacted by a changing climate as well, and that everything starts with pollution. I'll just say a recording of this session will be made available to all of the registrants and posted on the AFN's YouTube channel. And we will follow up with all of the registrants also with a questionnaire to share some discussion questions and also continue the dialogue offline as well. But with that, Dr. Horn, thank you so much for your time and your presentation. And we'll go to Dr. Point for our closing. Thank you so much.